July 25, 2021. Episode 11, How Heroes Honor Those Lost. 20th Day of Flame Rule. Weather forecast: clear, warm and sunny day. Lord Trescar Slan currently holds the highest authority of Secomber. He is a man of nobility and a war hero. He was willing to face off with a dragon alone, in order to protect our hometown. And he is also a friend to Kelmorn Pompledy, which meant he too was grieving the loss of him. This much was clear from the way he approached a distraught moose, who had been on her knees before her fallen father. I backed away upon seeing the grave expression over his face. He helped my friend back to her feet and spoke to her with consideration. He said a lot of what the rest of us could not bring ourselves to at that time, both the harsh realities of what had happened, as well as words of somber condolences. He did this all while handling the arrangements of Kelmorn's remains, pulling Moose away from the scene of his demise, and leaving the rest of us to follow a small distance away out of respect for their privacy. They didn't wander far. We were still within earshot when he spoke the truths that I think none of us wanted to face. That failing to kill those who had been a threat had led us here. I don't want to swallow that truth, but I must. We must. Maybe Thane and his way of thinking has been more correct than I was willing to admit. Lord Slan had questioned us, myself and Kairax, about what had happened. What we had been through on our quest to rescue Moose's parents. And it forced us to go over all of those who had survived and gotten away, the ones who may have been responsible for what might possibly be an act of vengeance. Vengeance or terrorism? That, I know not. All I know for sure is they took someone from us. Someone very kind. A father figure in every way that mattered, and I have no forgiveness left in me towards them for that act. The bandits in the cave, those kobolds, the Hark. Their lady. Followers of Tiamat. The filth of this world dragged by our own heels into my home. Left to pilfer our possessions and destroy our buildings. Collapse our town and ultimately spit in our faces before taking the life of someone dear to us. I feel wholly responsible. But I can't live solely with that weight on my shoulders. I must instead carry on, in an effort to lift it from myself and my comrades. We must do what we can to set things right. A contribution, even if it is a small one at that, to start. It is the only way to move forwards. Thankfully, we were given that opportunity right away. Lord Slan had called upon the shopkeeper of Alchemically Yours as a means of getting antidotes made for all of those who had been affected by the Green Dragon's breath attack. Leda Goldbean stepped forwards, but reported that he was low on the mushrooms he needed to make enough potions for everyone who was sick. He would need to go to the Misty Forest right away and retrieve more. I volunteered us to aid him upon hearing this. Lord Slan gave us permission and demanded we leave at once, despite the gates having been shut on his order. So with that, we followed Leda Goldbean southwest towards Wildgate, once we had the horses geared up. Once there, we were given a little bit of trouble from the guards about leaving town, but Kairax and I were able to convince them to let us through. We just mentioned what we were tasked with, and they seemed to realize its importance. We set out on horseback. It was still a warm and sunny day. Downright peaceful in contrast when facing away from Secomber, where black smoke was still hovering over town. It was like having an omen at your back. And the mood between everyone during that ride, well, it felt as much. We were all so forlorn. And I think special notice was paid to Moose by everyone. I had observed her putting on a determined face when we left the Temple of Yondola, but now while on the ride she seemed like she was in a daze. Not in her usual manner either. There was something very troubling about the expression over her face. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Kyokyojo's windmouse came gliding along and appeared in front of Moose. It took some effort, but it managed to make her crack a smile by harmlessly teasing her horse's ears a little. There was a small lift in the tension after that. I found myself appreciating Kyokyojo a lot more after that act, even despite his often blunt and gruff exterior. As evening arrived, we decided to set up camp for the night. Lady Goldbean had warned us about the Fae. Most of us turned in pretty early. I remember Thane looking especially worn out. It had been a long day, and we were ready for it to be over. I remember Kairax being awake still, and up to something before sleep finally claimed me. 21st of Flame Rule, we awoke to find our camp surrounded by a circle of wildflowers in full bloom. They hadn't been there the night before, so I checked for signs of a spell effect. There seemed to be a divine, radiant energy coming from the flowers. Kairax smiled and let us know that it was a blessing from Melora, and followed up by asking how Moose had slept. Moose replied with saying her rest had been surprisingly peaceful. Kairax had prayed to Melora, and asked for her aid in easing some of Moose's anguish that night so that she may sleep peacefully. Melora had answered, and the flowers were left behind as a result. We started to pack up camp, and though we were still feeling the burden of Secomber's attack and Kelmorn's loss, the air felt a little less heavy on this day than it had the day before. Though Thane still appeared pretty worn down, and that concerned me. He really had taken a beating in town, or so I found out. We were back on our horses making our way towards the misty forest for about an hour, when nearby voices had become apparent. I paused listening carefully. They were speaking to one another in a different language. One I had become abundantly familiar with recently. Draconic. I casted Comprehend Languages, so I could try and catch what they were saying. I could make out about 4 distinct voices. They were speaking about some form of loot presumably. Saying, "I can't believe we got as much as we did." I translated their words and let the party know there was at least 4 of them, likely more. They sounded as though they weren't much further ahead. Just around the bend of the road before us, but we couldn't spot them from our position. Kairax called upon a little bird friend, a sparrow. It landed on her finger and we all watched her chirp at the bird. She gave it some seed before it took flight, making a trip around the bend, before returning to her hand. It seemed to speak to her one more time, before flying off. Kairax informed us that the voices belonged to kobolds, somewhere between 6 and 9 of them, and that they apparently had loot from town still on them. With this information we planned an attack. Kyokyojo moved ahead, positioning himself amongst the trees. Thane summoned his infamous ghost pig to run through their camp, forcing their attention in the other direction. Svend charged them once they were looking the other way. Kairax followed suit. Moose, myself and Thane remained back during most of the fight. Moose eventually moved in closer to use Shocking Grasp. This battle went on for a while, but after defeating a couple of the kobolds, the remaining ones began to flee from us. We were not able to stop them from getting away, but they did leave some of what they had stolen behind. Various loot from town. One item that stuck out from the rest was a gold idol of Shauntia. I decided to take this myself. I figured if nothing else, we could take it to the temple because someone was likely looking for it, and they could find it there. We took to the road again shortly after the fight. It was still early in the day once we had made it to the outskirts of the misty forest. We once again left the horses behind as we entered the brush. The first thing I noted upon entering the forest was the atmosphere. It felt heavy and weighed down by magic, almost as though it were humid. Next came the sights. Nature was lush and thriving here, in a way my eyes had never seen before. We made our trek through the forest, some of us a bit awestruck. Taking everything in, as Lady Goldbean led the way. I remember thinking it was nearly sensory overload already, when an odd sound was added to the mix. I brought my head up straining to listen. I was hearing what sounded like some kind of soft and comforting music. I began to ask everyone if they were hearing it as well. Everyone stopped moving, listening for the music. I stepped towards the direction I thought it was coming from and realized it was getting louder. I looked back at my friends and they were all still standing around with confusion over their faces. None of them could hear it, so I told them to follow me. It wasn't long before we came upon a cave. This was definitely where the source of the music was coming from. As I neared the mouth of the cave, I spotted something gold, floating above me. A fairy. I followed it inside of the cave where there was a pool of water. Above this pool were many of these same-looking gold fairies. They all seemed to be waiting for me to arrive. It was at this point that I can't recall if the others were with me. I know I had been asking them if they saw the fairy, but they told me they hadn't been able to. And at the time, I wasn't concerned about that. I had just been focused on speaking to the fairies as they greeted me. They all spoke to me in unison as though they were one with many voices. The conversation I had with them was the strangest part of the whole thing. They hinted at there being a reason why I was the only one who could see, hear and speak to them, but they wouldn't tell me why. They then told me they would let me know more if I could help them. I asked them what they needed. At this question, the mass of gold fairies formed into the shape of one larger gold fairy, but the tip of her one wing appeared unfinished. She still sounded as though she were made up of many voices. She explained that one of her fairies was missing. That she had been missing for over a century. She was known as the spirit of adventure, and she had wandered off into the high moor only to never return. I felt a sense of pain for their plight, and I told them that I would try and help them, but I wasn't sure how soon before I could. Only, because we were already headlong into another quest. The fairy seemed understanding and patient. I asked her if she had a name to go by. She said that in this realm she has been called Casa. After finding this out, and making sure there wasn't any other information they could tell me, I wished them a farewell. While on my way out of the cave, I heard them wish me good luck on my quest and then something else. They said something else that I couldn't make out, as their voices had begun to fade. The further I stepped away from the cave, the more I felt my head returning. Everyone was staring at me with perplexed faces, and I realized then, it felt like I had just had a fevered dream. I began to explain to everyone what had just happened. The whole plight of the fairies and everything, but I could see they were not buying what I told them. It was hard to persuade them too. Especially when I felt strange about the whole thing myself, after having stepped away from it all. Moose seemed upset with me as well, accusing me of ignoring her. I apologized for that. Kairax said, it seemed as though I had been under a spell. Sven just referred to it as cave madness, claiming to have seen it before. Lastly, I looked to Leda Goldbean and asked if he had ever heard of gold fairies in the misty forest speaking to people, like what I had just encountered. He just spoke a warning at me, saying the Fae are not to be trusted. I watched Thane nod in agreement, while Kyokyojo stayed characteristically quiet. I looked to all of them surrounding me, hanging my head a bit in shame and embarrassment. Did I just fall for a trick? Or was I under a spell effect? It's difficult to say, because at the time I felt safe. I felt as though I could trust them, so I didn't bother with checking for any kind of spells, and I wasn't being careful like I normally would be. They didn't harm me either though, so I just don't know. My gut says to trust them. It was hard to hold up my resolve though, when faced with everyone's judging eyes. So, I just don't know what to think.